I'm happy to make it a dialogue. I don't know if you want to
Yeah.
make
No,
if
let's make
you
more dialogue. Okay,
yeah,
so
because I mean I'm learning from you.
mm,
I don't know if you want what you just told me on the record, but
mm.
any other insights that you might have would be great.
Okay, well, just do a quick intro. So, just to tell everyone, I'm speaking to Sam Husseini. He's a Palestinian American journalist. I got to know him a little bit through Twitter, actually through the pandemic stuff, because he was one of the first people to question what happened in Wuhan. But the topic today is actually about the Genocide Convention and South Africa taking Israel to the International Court of Justice. Yeah, so Sam, welcome, and look forward to this.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you, Hugo.
So I want to sort of just ask you. I mean, I had to learn this from your work, but what is the difference between the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court?
The International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, settles disputes between nations. Fundamentally. And it's a very old institution. Its precursor predates the United Nations. Um, the International Criminal Court was founded around 2000, and it goes after, or is supposed to go after, individuals. Um, the ICJ has some reputation for even-handedness and has ruled against Israel, for example, against the wall back in 2004. It ruled against the U.S. in in a case brought forth by Nicaragua during the 1980s. The ICC has largely acted as an instrument of US policy. It has gone after Africans and it's gone after Putin. It's never gone after the US or NATO or Israel or anything else.
Right.
So, yeah.
So why wouldn't the US? I mean, as I understand, the US, they basically undermine any institution that is supposed to uphold principles of international law, whatever that means these days. But why can't they so easily undermine this court?
Because it's the foundational court, it's the high court of the United Nations. They will try to undermine it. They did try to undermine it during the Nicaragua case. In some respects, they probably tried to undermine it during the Bosnia case. Um, but you know, well, it's not clear how far they're going to go this time. The president of the court right now happens to be a former U.S. State Department official. And I would imagine that she is in close consultation with Blinken and company about how to minimize and undermine the efforts of the South African government at this point. They may be limited, um, uh, but I imagine that they're going to attempt to sabotage the effort one way or the other.
Yeah. So I've looked at. I haven't read all the documents yet because it's 82 pages, if I'm not mistaken. So something from that nature, and but it's quite comprehensive. Some of the stuff in there. The lawyers that South Africa put forward, the ones I know, seem to be quite heavy, like sort of legal hotshots in South Africa, if you can call that, and heavyweights. Some of them, the Stemba Nkwahitu guy, he's a bit of a loose cannon type of person. He's had some cases that are a bit ideologically slanted, left wing slanted in South Africa. So you can understand why he would take up this case. But he's got a little bit of that in it. The other ones seem to be classical academics in there, and then the rest I just don't know their names. Maybe they're good, maybe they're not. So, but it does seem the South African government serious about this issue, right? Then the much impression you get.
Yeah, that's the impression I get. The only name that I know on the list, just my own ignorance, is Dugard.
Yeah,
I know him as a prominent opponent of apartheid, and and someone who was also a special rapporteur on the occupied territories for a time. So he knows the Palestinian situation, and he
right.
has a very, you know, pres- prestigious and proud legal legacy regarding apartheid. Um, I don't know the others. I'd be interested.
Some of the others are younger lawyers, so they wouldn't have been alive during apartheid. The ones I'm thinking of is guy's Temba. I just can't pronounce his surname. It's a Xhosa surname. It's very difficult. He wrote a book on land disputes in South Africa and the history of it's sort of like blacks being deprived of their land at one stage. The book was criticized in the white press by being biased. It's the nature of these things. But be that it may, he's a deep legal scholar. Okay, so he would know these strip dispossession type of things. So yeah, I've looked at that. I thought that is serious. Uh, as I understand it, it's in January now that they probably have a ruling, or how would that work?
I'm seeing reports. I don't think that they posted it on the
Right.
ICJ web page yet, but I'm seeing reports January 11th and 12th.
Okay.
I think South Africa had asked for sooner than that, but that's still, fairly soon.
That's good on I would argue, good on the South African government's part, because our elections is in March. Uh, opinion polls, I don't know what to make of them, but there are some polls that suggest the ANC might lose their absolute majority that they once had and be forced into a coalition government.
Yeah.
And the opposition government, who's likely to join them, would be the Democratic Alliance. They are very much pro-Israel through their funders, but the electorates actually have divided on this issue, and we've seen major infighting within the largest opposition party over this issue in particular. They've even fired one of their ministers who's saying he's in favor of Palestine, which, yeah, no, it's a difficult coalition because it's seen as a white-only part. It's not really in practice, but it's clearly where their money comes from. Okay, so you had that type of thing coming up. So I see some red flags with our elections coming up. But if this thing happens now, then maybe maybe the ANC thought of that.
Yeah, I don't. What's the name of the other coalition that they might?
So it's the Democratic Alliance is the political
Democratic
party,
Alliance.
and they control the Western Cape province, which is the second largest province. Yeah, as I say, I can envision if they would come into power and coalition, they can. I don't know if you can derail this process, but I can envision them trying to do something. Okay.
That's fascinating. I don't know.
Mm.
I mean, I know very little about South African politics. I'm amazed that there's any significant sectors of it that are pro-Israeli, but I guess the pro-Israeli lobby has a lot of different manifestations. Given the close
They-
alliance between Israel and the apartheid
It's
regime.
it's interesting the way it is appears because it's coming through fundamentalist Christian movements,
Mhm,
like Christian Zionist movements.
mhm,
I give an example. I was interviewed on an Afrikaans radio to talk about this issue,
mhm,
and the guy lost my interview. And I said, "Okay, let's do it again."
mm.
And then he said, "Let's do it next morning." Didn't show up.
Well,
So I don't know what to infer from that.
wants to waste your time. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but it was quite a comprehensive interview we did, and now the recording is gone. So, I it's still, I would say, uncomfortable for whites, even in South Africa, to give a favorable opinion of Palestine. Those that do tend to be in academia. Okay,
Mhm.
so that is there, but remember, the whites are not the majority in South Africa.
And
Um,
I mean, are they openly, you know, uh, reminiscing about the apartheid government?
They would never use it in those terms, obviously. But what you would find is that there's a sector of the population that, first of all, is biblical. Remember, apartheid was also through Bible. So just God promised the Jews Israel. I've heard that so many times, which is just, it still shocks me. That's the level of argumentation goes on.
Mhm,
And then you have some of them that are just bought into the US narrative, where they believe that I would say Israel is under attack, under siege by Muslim extremists, and Hamas a terrorist organization, and they bought that entire storyline.
mm.
I've seen so many people fall for that, and you'd think they'd know better, but it is what it is.
Yeah. Okay. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
So, in terms of legal process here,
Mm,
the one major thing is, if other countries will join in to back up South Africa
right.
and file what's called declarations of intervention. So you could see, um, a whole host of countries doing that. Malaysia just put out a statement. They're not in an ideal legal position to do it because they have a reservation on the relevant article in the Genocide Convention. Um, but others like Colombia or Brazil, one would expect would be doing, and then that could open up to a whole slew of others.
And I mean, I would hope Brazil joins in because it would.
I'm sorry.
I would hope that Brazil joins in, or one bigger country.
Yeah.
Um, my suspicion is that the US will, if this goes through, let me put it this way, and South Africa is alone with, say, a few insignificant countries politically. Um, I do suspect that the US government will go out of its way to try and undermine the South African government in other areas.
Yes,
Okay.
that I would expect that from the U.S. I think the U.S. has a history of reprisals of different sorts against any government that attempts to challenge its dictates, which is
Well,
what's going on here. So
they did something similar in South Africa. I mean, it's difficult always to pinpoint it exactly on US because it's these things always come together with other internal factions in the country. But the ANC has internal factions within it, and some of them are more aligned with US business corporate elites, if you will, and others tend to be more social democratic. And they have, when Thabo Mbeki was in power, for example, exploited that faction to bring Jacob Zuma in. So I wouldn't say the US backed him entirely, but certainly the media started changing their tune on one faction to the other. So I can see things like that happening in the country. It wouldn't surprise me.
yeah, so I think that that's why a lot of people, a lot of activists are trying to get other countries involved, so that South Africa becomes less
Yeah,
targetable.
I,
Uh,
I've also seen Oman. I don't know if you maybe
That
know that.
that could well be possible. That
Yeah.
they both called it genocide, and they are in a good position in terms of the legal
Mm.
parameters to file a declaration. Lots of countries are. I put up a Substack that sort of gives a breakdown of the
Mm.
different countries if people want to check
Right.
that out.
And what do you think is the? I mean, obviously, I understand you're Palestinian here, but proving genocide, in my view, has always been a very difficult thing to prove, right? Do you think the legal criteria is sustained? I mean, I understand Israel's done all of these things.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very serious legal document that the South African government has put forward. And lots of people, including Craig Mokhiber, the um, UN whistleblower, have made the point that this is a somewhat unique situation because the Israeli officials are outright saying genocidal things. They're saying no water, no food, no electricity. That's a genocidal statement. You just had that was the so-called defense minister at the very beginning of October. Just the other day, you had the finance minister say things will look very different if we only have 1 or 200,000 Palestinians in Gaza. Uh, indicating that that's their goal.
So
Um,
intent is there. Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, so intention is obviously there. I
The
mean, just
intention is there,
yeah.
and they're openly stating it. So, and much of this was documented in the 84 pages. So, um, I think this case in some ways is unique in that the brazenness with which the Israeli officials have articulated what it is they're doing.
Yeah, that's I mean, I just still find it frightening. What I find frightening is the intensity of the propaganda and the willingness of people to just buy it. I I I,
Yeah,
I cannot explain it.
yeah, and here I think that the propaganda almost becomes a clarifying agent. If you think it through, the Israelis at the very beginning made claims about the 40 beheaded babies and all of this. Why did they do that? They did that in order to buy themselves more latitude in order to slaughter a lot of babies, which is what we've seen, which is real, which isn't a fable, which isn't propaganda. Um, so if you think about it, the propaganda is actually part of the genocidal intent. That is, you put out these stories of how horrific Hamas is, that they would kill all of these babies and so on, um, in order to give Israel more latitude to slaughter, because people, of course, are going to say, well, of course they got a bomb. These guys are monsters. They're beheading babies. Um,
What,
so,
what, what I find just astonishing is the ability of the Israeli officials to lie with
mm,
such a straight face. I
incredible.
just
It's incredible.
I don't know if you saw the response that the Israeli is it official? I can't remember what it is. Probably foreign minister or somebody gave to South Africa, where he basically now says South Africa is complicit in rape, South Africa is complicit in terrorism, South Africa is complicit in genocide. And I'm like, well, isn't that what you're just doing?
Yeah. And I mean, they lie with a straight face, and then they have this fake anger, where they're the perpetrators. And I mean, and then this predate. I've seen this from Israeli officials over the years, not just since October 7th. And I've noted how that they are likely coached in order to, if you appear angry, then that's a way of making people think that you're the wronged party, and that therefore, people will empathize with you, rather than, appearing, attempting to defend their criminal conduct. They don't try to do that. They pretend to be the aggrieved party and are angry at the situation, as if South Africa is doing something wrong here by going to court, while Israel, you know, hurls, bomb after bomb, in civilian areas.
Yeah, and the ability of, I mean, it's not surprising with the US media, um, but the ability of the US media to just ignore what is so obviously reality. I mean, they would even report the facts quite openly, but the
Mhm,
headlines is totally different from the facts. It's just
mhm,
astonishing.
mhm. Yeah, yeah. I do worry a great deal about the. I mean, I can don't have to go into this, but the ways in which the U.S. could try to go after South Africa
Yeah.
could be multitude.
Well, the
Uh,
major leverage they have, there's first issues to explain. South Africa has an electricity crisis at the moment. We have a shortage, so we have rolling blackouts. Um, it's very easy to sabotage an electrical system.
hmm,
Um, we need natural gas, for example. Imports US leverage. Okay, that's one way I would envision them going after. The other thing is 30% of South Africa's trade belongs to AGOA, which is the US almost subsidizing our imports in a way. It's a very gracious policy of the US government. And previously, when we tried to sign cooperative agreements with Russia, okay, I think a bit foolish on our government not to preempt it, but be that as it may, the US threatened to sanction our trade.
hmm,
So you can clearly see them punishing a society that's quite poor. I mean,
hmm,
South Africa is the richest in Africa, but by US standards,
hmm.
I mean we're still a very poor society. So you can easily see how they could economically punish a society for going this way.
Yeah, I could totally see it. I mean, one of the when we originally connected over the pandemic, one of the pieces that I was working on researching with respect to the pandemic was one of the signers of the Lancet letter, that
Yeah.
pretended that it was a conspiracy theory that COVID could come out of a lab, was Charles Kalischer. So I dug into him a little bit, and I found this story that might be interesting for us to keep in mind. Um, in around 19 in the late 70s, of course, Cuba was helping the rebels in Angola, um, and uh, Charles Kalischer, this U.S. scientist, went to Cuba, and he told them, "You got to be careful about this, because some of these people could come back with dengue fever, and then you'd be in big trouble." Um, Shortly thereafter, uh, dengue fever broke out in Cuba. The Cubans, for a variety of reasons, charged that Charles Kalischer and or other U.S. scientists weren't simply warning, that they actually helped spread it. Um, so it was a warning shot saying you could get dengue fever if with
Yeah.
your troops in Angola and they're going to come back. The Cubans claim that the way that the outbreak happened in what parts of the country and so on indicated that it didn't happen from soldiers coming back. It was planted there by U.S. operatives. Um, so that was one way that the U.S. took revenge, attacked Cuba for standing up to its dictates.
Mm.
I haven't seen, I mean, Kalischer obviously denies the charges. I've done some research in it. I think it's a very serious allegation, not to be dismissed. I don't think that it's proven. I wanted to go to Cuba to investigate it further, but that is an indication of the kind of thing that the United
Well,
States could do.
well, when I researched the HIV and AIDS story, Tom Mbeki constituted a panel to try to get the root cause.
Mm.
And when I spoke to one of the scientists there, David Resnick, he said to me, the panel was broken up beforehand by what they assumed.
You talked to David Resnick at
Yeah,
Stanford?
no, it's David Resnick who was working with Peter Duisberg.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
and he said to me that panel was broken up by what they assumed to be a CIA agent. And Mbeki said then in public the CIA is after him, and they called him a conspiracy theorist.
Mm.
Okay. So, what does one make of that? I know Clinton in 1990s, around that year, declared AIDS or HIV a national security issue, and that fell in part under the scope of the CIA. Okay. So, it's the same story that you just told in a different way.
Yeah.
The other one is Victoria Newland was in South Africa a few months ago, actually.
Right.
I don't know, you remember this conference between Naledi Pandor and what's her name, and Tony Blinken during the Ukraine war. And then in that conference, she quite bravely said, and look, she is Muslim, she's very sympathetic to the Palestinians. I think it's maybe an error of judgment to say it so in the face of the US admin, but so that's what it was. But she said she's not going to support the Russian-Ukraine war condemnation if we don't condemn Israel in the same way, basically, which is a fair statement, but it's just,
At the meet.
geopolitics in mind, it might be foolish to say it that way.
Yeah.
So it's quite a strong statement against Israel at that time. A
Right.
few months later, Victoria Newland was in South Africa and praising our energy transition or this or that. So I've been, my brains have been gone up over the energy issue sometime because,
Well, they
you don't know what to make of these things, but it is there.
very interesting. Very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, the other thing about this, so the case stuff is Israel. I mean, is it possible still for Israel to defend themselves against any of these claims? I mean, they would obviously defend themselves, but you would think what defense would they have to come up with to do it?
Yeah, I mean, their standard talking points are we have to hit these hospitals because that's where Hamas is hiding, um, and so on. But then how do they defend themselves against no electricity, no food, no water? How do they defend themselves against, they just blew up the legal building of the the bar association in Gaza. Um, uh, you know, um, everything becomes a Hamas fighters are hiding there allegation.
Right.
Um, so I don't know. It's but I think that they will pull potentially some crazy stunts. I mean, look at what they've been doing at the UN with their holding up you know placards and speeches and screaming and whatever. So God knows what kind of antics that they might try to engage in. But I think that you have that South Africa has a very capable and serious team.
Mm.
And all I can hope is that the South African people understand.
I would say the pressure on the government from the unions in particular is strong. From the traditional ANC voters is very strong on this issue.
Right.
From what I've seen in just normal discussions, we would sit in a meeting, a business meeting, and it will pop up. It popped up every second week that I was in a meeting with, even if it was totally irrelevant. So clearly there's an anger boiling over these things. The meme spreading and stuff is angering the population. So this is what gives me some hope is even if the US tries to undermine the South African government, um, I'm quite convinced the population will work out whatever regime they try and put in place. Okay. Or puppet. They can only do it through a democratic election. The population won't buy a coup or anything of that sort. It's just not there. But they will quickly see through it as a puppet regime if it is ever instated. Okay. But I don't think the US can do much now because you say the if the court case is within the next month, the US won't have leverage to do that. So then it was actually good judgment on the part of the SA government.
To move when they did, you're saying, rather than wait.
Yeah, I mean they left it till the late. They made
Yeah.
no they kept it quite secret. Obviously, they
Yeah.
kept absolutely no indication that they were ever going to act on it. I didn't expect it. I mean, I spoke to officials of the government and others that as well,
Yeah.
and people just thought that they're singing along and waiting for the opportunity. So it was clearly well planned and orchestrated by the South African government in secret.
Yeah.
Okay, so they thought it through. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what else is. Yeah, the other issue I want to get your view on is the nuclear issue on Israel. I haven't seen many activists go this way. This was actually given to me by Noam Chomsky, where he mentions Israel has weapons, and if Israel's weapons is ever officially acknowledged by the US, then under existing US law, theoretically the aid to Israel must be suspended. That's never going to happen, but you know.
Yeah. It's um, it's part of what was called the Glenn Symington amendments and part of the Arms Export Act. There is actually provisions for there to be a deferment that the president would have to do every couple of months in order to keep
Right.
the aid going, but they don't want to do that presumably, so they just pretend that Israel doesn't have nuclear weapons, or they refuse to acknowledge one way or the other. I mean, I go to the State Department briefings at times, and I've asked them about this. So over the course of the last year, um, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, his last
Mm.
published article, to my knowledge, was about a year before his death, in which he admonished Biden to finally acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons and to cut off aid as a result of that. You have upwards of $300 billion of U.S. Funding to Israel over the decades, all in violation of U.S. law. Um, uh,
Yeah.
the origins of the whole thing are, Kennedy tried to stop it. Apparently, John F. Kennedy, when he was president, pressed Ben Gurion to say,
Mm.
"You got to let inspections in. We're not buying this. We don't want you guys to be developing nuclear weapons because the whole region's going to go down this road and cause instability and so on." He's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Um, and then Ben Gurion kept putting him off. And then Ben Gurion resigned in an apparent effort to continue to delay it. And then finally, Kennedy himself was assassinated.
Right.
So that's how effectively the Israeli nuclear weapons arsenal was born. And it continues to have this completely extrajudicial thing and this crazy situation where no one in the U.S. acknowledges it. I mean, even members of the squad. I've approached the offices of Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan
Mm.
Omar and so on. They will not say, yes, Israel has nuclear weapons.
This is weird.
It's amazing to me, and it really shows the extent to which I think Congress basically takes its cues from the State Department.
Well, there's few documentation. So when the apartheid government had nuclear weapons, I happen to know some of the people who worked on those programs at the time, and the author, one of the directors of the bomb programs, a man by the name of von Willy, he's still alive, but he's 82 or 3. I don't think his memory's there anymore. And he wrote a book about South Africa's programs. And in that book, he didn't say it directly, which was also strange, but you can sort of deduce that there was Israeli-South African cooperation at the time,
Mhm,
which, there's now documentation linking P.W. Botha and Shimon Peres when both were Minister of Defenses having minutes at the time.
mhm.
So, I was always wondering if another state were to bring that case to the IAEA, would it be possible to call for inspections or not? Can the US just undermine the IAEA?
I meant to a state to get the IAEA to inspect.
Yeah, to inspect Israel's weapons arsenal because they're in
Yeah,
violation of the charter.
of the IAEA charter.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I don't know what the legalities of that are. I mean, Israel never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Uh,
right,
it also never signed the Biological Weapons Convention. So I'm not sure what the legal remedies would be there. I don't know.
right. Because I was thinking. South Africa
I don't have.
theoretically can pressure Egypt to ratify the Treaty of Pelindaba, which the US, by the way, is undermining by stationing weapons in Diego Garcia, the African Nuclear Weapons Free Treaty. And there's a suspicion that if that treaty comes into effect, Egypt's aid for Israel, which is substantial, their military support and intelligence sharing and things would come into question.
Hmm.
The question is always how much can the African Union or the African states really pressure Egypt? I suspect not much because it's a US proxy after all.
Mhm.
But if that diplomatic leverage would come into play, what that would do to reveal the Israeli nuclear weapons issue.
Yeah. Could you clarify what's the treaty that you're referring to?
So
I know
the Treaty of Pelindaba is the
much
African.
about it.
It basically states that because South Africa was the first country to give up our weapons voluntarily. Okay,
Correct.
and we basically expanded that to the entire Africa. At that time, Mandela and Thabo Mbeki basically got all of Africa to sign and ratify that Africa will be a nuclear weapons free zone. But there's two exceptions to that. One is Egypt has signed but never ratified the treaty, and the second one is Diego Garcia that falls under the treaty. It's been acknowledged by Great Britain, but then they wanted to put a clause in the treaty saying Diego Garcia is an exception. And the reason is the US has nuclear weapons in Diego Garcia.
Mhm.
Okay. So it's I've always questioned how much this issue had to do with the Israeli issue, given that Egypt has never been forced to ratify the treaty.
See, I mean, Egypt did sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Right,
Um, Israel's Egypt's presumed deterrence to Israel is its chemical weapons. Uh,
right,
so um, presumably that's how Egypt ultimately would protect itself in the event that Israel were to use nuclear weapons against it. Um, I don't know anything beyond that.
right. Well, the African treaty goes further that you're theoretically not allowed to trade or engage with a state that's selling these things, something of that nature. But enforceability is always a question because everyone trades with the US and
Right.
other countries, right? So it's one of those treaties.
Right.
Um, but yeah, the nuclear issue I find is a significant part of this. How one ever gets the US to acknowledge Israel as nuclear weapons, I don't know. And how is it possible to blackmail the entire US Senate, as you say, or Congress or Foreign State Department is extraordinary. They can't even admit it in public.
Yeah, it is extraordinary. But I've seen this pattern in the U.S. at times on critical issues where you effectively have most of the Congress just echo a line from us from the State Department, and it really shows how weak U.S. democracy is in a lot of ways. But you're seeing something, hopefully, of a revival here. You're seeing an unprecedented level of activism
Mm.
around the genocide of Gaza and so on. So this is a true horror show. There's no doubt about that. But it is, I think, um, compelling people to step up in
Yeah.
ways that are outside their comfort zone and that might conceivably long term have have positive consequences. I mean, if South Africa wins, then the genuine international law might be able to manifest itself more, so that the law isn't just simply an instrument of the powerful against the weak, but is something that everyone has to abide by. So if
Mm.
that is part of what comes out of it, then it could end up saving a great deal of further disasters in Palestine and elsewhere.
Right. What do you make of the stability of Netanyahu's government? Because he was under a lot of pressure before this started, right?
Right, and the Supreme Court just ruled against him, so he seems to be on the ropes. But I don't know. I don't. I try to follow internal Israeli politics, but I'm not
Mm.
as steeped in it as I'd wish. And there's good and bad things coming out of that because, I mean, you sort of don't, you know, Netanyahu's terrible, murderous, genocidal, but so are so many other elements of the Israeli establishment.
Yeah.
And you want a genuine shift. You don't want there to be a rebranding operation
Right.
to revamp Israel and make it look good again. After and then they toss Netanyahu out the door and say, "Oh, now we're," and they have they find I don't know, an Obama type figure to rebrand themselves. I don't know what's in the future, but that is one concern about how
Mm.
this unfurls. But obviously the imperative is to stop the bombing, to stop the genocidal conduct, and to have some level of accountability. I mean, we keep going from disaster to disaster: Iraq invasion, pandemic, this genocide, because there's never an accountability to the perpetrators. So, the South African action against Israel could be the beginning of a meaningful accountability and could have far reaching positive consequences because people will begin to understand that even if you're powerful, if you do criminal activity, you're going to have to pay for it. And
Yeah.
that hopefully will be a severe deterrent to powerful people conducting disasters in the future.
And do you think if this thing goes through, it can extend to the US officials that are obviously enabling this type of criminality?
It could well. It
No.
could well. I mean, one major problem is that the ICC prosecutor, Khan, is corrupt and is doing the U.S. bidding. But they're, with a genocide finding by the International Court of Justice, that could open doors in a number of ways. Um,
Mm.
that could ultimately, I mean, there are lawsuits in the United States now by the Center for Constitutional Rights against Biden and the administration.
Mm.
There could be a universal jurisdiction efforts. There could be a whole host of things that could be used to step by step have actual justice be parceled out here.
Well, I would say this if I draw parallels between Israel and South Africa has always been done for obvious reasons, but um, the apartheid government towards the end was at its most extreme. If it made sense, because they were the most desperate at that stage.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, P.W. Botha was far worse than John Foster. John Foster killed people, but Botha militarized society in ways that that others didn't. And he got desperate. They started building all kinds of crazy stuff. So I've gotten this impression out of Israel as well, that they also understand that Israel's existence, as it currently stands, depends on U.S. public opinion very strongly. And there's definitely been a shift majorly in U.S. opinion. I've never seen the U.S. right or libertarians so anti-Israel as they are at this stage, and that has to filter through to them at some stage. So I get the impression they're more desperate, and that's why they're so much more genocidal.
Yeah, that could well be. Then the challenge becomes ending it as peacefully as possible.
As quickly as possible. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
as peacefully as, because again, we
yeah.
are, nuclear weapons are there, and they might not be as far-sighted as
Well,
the South Africans in terms of saying, okay, we're going to walk away from having nuclear weapons.
Well, the logic of South Africa to acquire nuclear weapons was something. I mean, it's a sort of a deterrent strategy, but it was basically we are crazy enough to use them, but we don't tell you we have them. Something of that sort. It's also like ambiguous policy.
Yeah, similar.
I still think that even Netanyahu has a self-preservation streak to not be as stupid to throw a nuclear bomb in his own country.
Yeah, well, I never thought that. I mean, I know that you had one minister, say, we're going to use nuclear weapons against Gaza. I don't think that anybody's contemplating that. I think that the threat is to
Yeah.
Iran or, Damascus or, conceivably Cairo or,
Yeah.
or Moscow. I mean, that is how Israel would use its nuclear weapons. I believe.
Yeah, and well, my view is I think Israel wants to provoke another war in the region. They
And
want to get the US to be there.
they just did an assassination in Beirut, so that
Yeah.
would seem to, yeah.
Yeah, to get the US there. So I mean, I think that's also the US needs to resist. Okay, well, there's a handful of this. I mean, it's just sort of a last question, I think, before we go here. What is the actual situation in Gaza as you understand it now? I
It's
mean,
horrific.
yeah.
Vast majority of the population is displaced. Majority of the buildings have been destroyed or severely damaged. Um, uh, all of the, relief organizations are saying that this is unprecedented in terms of what they're seeing.
Mhm.
And of course, it was already a horrible situation in Gaza with the siege and the past bombings and lack of
Mhm.
control and so on. So I think it's very precarious. And I think that South Africa's action, you know, might seems to be the best hope of trying to get some relief in terms
Yeah.
of getting in there and in terms of stopping the bombing.
All right. All right. Well, thanks a lot for this conversation. So I
Thank you so
appreciate the
much.
exchange. And yeah, as I said to anyone who listens to this, I mean, just spread the word around so we can hopefully get other countries to join as well. And, see how it goes.
I was good talking to you.
Thanks.
Thank you.